Collins Care Headquarters, 11:42 p.m. A woman is watching her life burn down. The office is dark, the only light spilling from the monitor where the upload bar crawls toward the end. I am Teresa Collins, the invisible daughter of a medical empire, and in exactly 18 seconds, I will be its executioner. My father built this kingdom on the belief that loyalty means silence, that he could erase me from the picture whenever he pleased. But he forgot that the invisible ones see everything. The file sends. The war begins. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The morning my dad suspended me and tried to erase me from our family's story, I didn't argue. I didn't scream or throw the heavy crystal tumbler on his desk across the room. I just looked at him, nodded, and said, "All right." To understand why I didn't fight back in that moment, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the moment my parents decided which child mattered more. We grew up in one of those mid-sized cities in Colorado where the mountains are always visible but feel just out of reach. In our town, the name Collins was printed on everything. It was on the back of the Little League jerseys, on the banners at the 4th of July parade, and most importantly, glowing in blue neon above the entrance of the Collins Care Network. My parents, Dr. Michael Collins and Nurse Linda Collins, had built a medical empire from scratch. It started as a single urgent care clinic in a strip mall and grew into a network of facilities and a small community hospital that served the working-class neighborhoods the big city systems ignored. On the surface, we were the perfect American dream story. My father was the charismatic hero, the doctor who would shake your hand and ask about your mother's hip surgery while buying you a coffee. He was beloved. He was a savior. But inside our house, the dynamic was very different. There were 2 children in the Collins house, but if you listened to my father speak at Rotary Club dinners, you'd swear there was only one. My older brother Ryan was the golden child. He was loud, extroverted, and possessed the kind of effortless charm that makes people want to give you money. He was the heir apparent groomed from birth to take over the empire. Then there was me, Teresa. I was quiet. I liked silence. I liked numbers because numbers were fair. They didn't play favorites. While Ryan was out being the star pitcher or the student body president, I was the one in the back office of the clinic on weekends, organizing patient charts and helping the elderly receptionists navigate the new computer systems. I remember the specific moment I realized my role in the family. I was about 12 years old. We were in the lobby of the main hospital for the unveiling of a new donor wall. A professional photographer had taken a family portrait to hang in the center of the lobby. When the velvet curtain was pulled back, everyone clapped. I stared at the photo, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. In the picture, my dad was center stage, beaming with his hand firmly on Ryan's shoulder. My mom was smiling warmly next to them. And me, I was on the far left half of my body, cut off by the frame. I looked like an accident, an afterthought they hadn't bothered to squeeze in properly. Later that afternoon, I was sitting around the corner from my dad's office, hidden by a vending machine, when I heard him talking to a wealthy donor. The man asked about his kids. "Ryan is a firecracker," my dad boomed. "He's the one we're building all this for. He's got the vision." The man asked, "And the girl?" My dad paused, his voice dropping to a dismissive, flat tone. "Teresa. She's reliable. She's good for the background work." I didn't cry. I just internalized it. My job was to be the support beam that no one sees but keeps the roof from collapsing. The only person who saw me clearly was my mother. She was the heart of the operation, the one who believed medicine was a service, not a business. She used to stay up late with me, going over my math homework. One night, after I'd told her about the photo in the lobby, she handed me a heavy fireproof metal box. She told me to keep my important papers in it. She looked me dead in the eye and whispered, "You don't have to be loud to matter, Tess. Don't let anyone erase you. One day, this will matter." I put that box under my bed and didn't open it for 15 years. Everything changed when Mom died. It was sudden and aggressive cancer that took her within months. With her gone, the warmth left Collins' care. My dad and Ryan pivoted. The mission shifted from service to growth. I was in my late 20s by then, working for the company as the compliance and operations officer. I had gone to law school and studied health administration, not to be the star, but to protect the thing my mother helped build. I built safety checks, designed ethical guidelines, and ensured we followed the law. I thought that was my value. I thought that by keeping us safe, I was earning my place at the table. But the atmosphere in the executive wing had turned rot. Ryan, now the VP of Growth, was constantly in meetings with private equity guys and insurance adjusters. Dad was obsessed with legacy, with making Collins Care big enough to swallow the competition. I mostly kept my head down, reviewing the endless streams of data that flowed through our system. That's when I saw it. It was a Tuesday night late. The office was empty, the only light coming from my dual monitors. I was reviewing billing reports from our 3 newest clinics in the poorest districts of the county. The numbers didn't make sense. These were urgent care clinics designed for flu shots and twisted ankles. But the data showed a massive spike in complex procedures and observation stays. Patients who should have been sent home with an antibiotic prescription were being coded as high-risk observation cases, billing the insurance companies 10 times the standard rate. The community we served was poorer than ever, yet our revenue from these specific zip codes was skyrocketing. I scrolled back 3 months. The trend was a vertical line. I cross-referenced the physician notes. They were vague, copy-pasted templates. My stomach turned over. This wasn't a clerical error. This was systematic. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my glasses, realizing that the reliable daughter had found the one thing she wasn't supposed to see. I looked at the rows and columns, the undeniable mathematical proof of something rotting beneath the floorboards of my father's house. I realized then that my reliability was about to become my greatest liability. Patterns don't ambush you. People do. I had spent 5 years building the compliance framework for Collins Care brick by boring brick. To the outside world, and certainly to my father, my department was nothing more than a necessary evil, a cost center that prevented them from moving as fast as they wanted. But to me, it was the hull of the ship. I believed in the American values of fair play and the sanctity of the handshake deal our patients thought they were getting when they walked through our doors. I believed that when a mechanic or a school teacher trusted us with their health, we owed them the truth, not a hidden fee. Ryan, however, saw things differently. As the VP of Growth, his job was to dazzle. He made flashy deals with insurers and courted private equity investors with slide decks full of buzzwords. My father beamed every time Ryan closed a deal, clapping him on the back and introducing him to everyone as the future of Collins Care. I was just the person who made sure the paperwork was filed correctly, but the paperwork was screaming at me. Following that late night with the spreadsheets, I started digging deeper into the operational reality behind the numbers. The pattern wasn't subtle, it was aggressive. There was a sharp, undeniable spike in high-revenue billing codes, specifically observation status. In medical billing, this is a gray area where a patient isn't sick enough to be admitted but isn't well enough to go home. It bills at a much higher rate than a standard visit. Suddenly, patients coming in with minor dehydration or chest colds were being held for 10 hours of observation. I needed human confirmation, so I visited one of our busiest clinics during a shift change. I found a nurse I had known since I was a teenager, a woman who used to give me lollipops when I waited for my dad. We stood in the supply closet, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air. When I asked her about the observation stays, she wouldn't meet my eyes. She told me that the directive came from up top. She described being subtly pushed to order unnecessary enzyme tests and keep beds filled just in case, not because the medicine demanded it, but because the daily revenue targets demanded it. I took my findings to Ryan first. I thought perhaps naively that he just didn't understand the legal exposure he was creating. I walked into his glass-walled office, laid the printed reports on his desk, and pointed out the anomalies. I expected him to look worried. Instead, he leaned back in his expensive ergonomic chair and sighed, looking at me with the pity one might reserve for a slow child. He waved his hand dismissively at my data. He told me this was how the big systems played the game. He asked if I wanted us to be swallowed up by the national chains, or if I wanted us to survive. He framed the fraud as resilience, as if overcharging grandmothers was a heroic act of fighting back against a rigged healthcare system. He called it creative revenue cycle management. I called it theft. 2 days later, my father called. He invited me to Sunday dinner at the main house. His voice was warm paternal. He said he just wanted to talk to catch up away from the stress of the office. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that if I could just sit him down and explain the moral and legal cliff we were driving toward, he would listen. I prepared a binder of evidence, keeping it factual and unemotional. When I arrived at the house, the smell of roast chicken filled the hallway, triggering a sudden sharp nostalgia for when Mom was alive. But when I walked into the dining room, the nostalgia died instantly. The table was set, but not for a family dinner. Ryan was there looking smug. My father sat at the head of the table, and to his right sat Arthur, the family's longtime personal attorney. This wasn't a dinner, it was an ambush. On the table sitting next to the crystal water pitcher was a stack of printouts. My internal emails, my query logs, my search history. I barely had time to set my purse down before my father started. He didn't ask about my day, he didn't ask about the data. He weaponized the concept of family loyalty immediately. He accused me of threatening the family's stability with my negativity and paranoia. He gestured to the lawyer who sat silently, a witness to my dressing down. Dad told me I was looking for problems where there were none, that I was trying to undermine Ryan's success because I was jealous. Then he twisted the knife. He invoked my mother. He looked at me with feigned disappointment and said Mom wouldn't want this fighting, that she would be heartbroken to see me attacking the company she built. I tried to speak, to open my binder, but he cut me off. The air in the room felt vacuum-sealed. Then he delivered the line that finally killed the daughter I used to be. He leaned forward, his face hard and unrecognizable. "You were always the one we could count on not to make trouble, Teresa. Ryan carries our name. You just keep the files from falling over. If I had to erase one of my kids from this story, it wouldn't be him." The words hit me like a physical blow. I went numb. My ears rang. I looked at Ryan, who looked away, unable to hold my gaze. I looked at my father, and I saw him clearly for the first time. This wasn't about business. This was about his ego. He needed a mirror to reflect his greatness, and Ryan was that mirror. I was just the crack in the glass he was trying to smooth over. I didn't scream. I stood up, picked up my binder, and turned to leave. I walked out of the house I grew up in, the silence trailing behind me. That night I realized my parents built Collins Care to serve a town. My dad was now using it to serve his ego, and he was ready to sacrifice me to keep it that way. The Monday after the ambush at the dinner table, the air in the executive wing of Collins Care was so cold, it felt brittle. I walked past the reception desk, and the silence that followed me wasn't the usual quiet of a busy office. It was the hush of people who knew a storm was coming. I didn't stop at my desk to check my voicemail. I went straight to the secure server logs, because a new contract had just landed in the system, one that Ryan and my father were pushing through with terrifying speed. They called it the Vitality Partnership, a massive deal with a third-tier insurance provider known for aggressive reimbursement strategies. I pulled up the draft contract, and within 10 minutes my legal training was screaming at me. The language wasn't just vague, it was predatory. There were clauses detailing revenue optimization targets that were statistically impossible to meet without systematic upcoding. It essentially required our physicians to find sickness where there was none. If a patient came in for a sore throat, the contract incentivized us to bill for a full respiratory workup. If we missed these targets, Collins Care would face penalties. If we hit them, the bonuses were astronomical. It was a trap designed to force fraud under the guise of efficiency. I didn't just read it, I documented it. I saved the email chains where Ryan told the coding team to get creative with the diagnosis codes. I took screenshots of the dashboards that showed the impossible quotas. I built a digital paper trail that led straight to the C-suite. I requested time on the agenda for the Wednesday board meeting. I knew this was my last stand. When I walked into the boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The long mahogany table was occupied by the usual faces, local business leaders, a retired judge, and of course my father and Ryan. They were laughing about a golf tournament until I closed the door. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I projected the internal report onto the screen. I walked them through the vitality partnership clause by clause. I used words like federal indictment, class action lawsuit, and revocation of license. I looked them in the eyes and said, "Our community trusted us when no one else did. We are the only hospital some of these families have. We cannot betray that trust for a quarterly bonus. If we sign this, we are crossing a legal line we can never uncross." For a moment, the room was silent. I thought I had reached them. Then my father cleared his throat. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the board members with a weary, indulgent smile. "Teresa has always been spirited," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But she sees shadows where there is only sunlight. This report is dramatic. It's negative. It threatens the morale of the very team we are trying to build." He turned the issue from legal fraud to personal loyalty. He painted me as the hysterical daughter trying to ruin the family's success. The board members, men who had known my father for 30 years, nodded in agreement. They didn't care about the billing codes. They cared about the stock dividends and the charisma of the man at the head of the table. They sided with him not because he was right, but because he was Michael Collins. 2 hours later, I was summoned to an emergency executive meeting in my father's office. It was just Dad, Ryan, and 2 of his staunchest allies from the board. There was no pretense of a discussion this time. My father stood behind his desk, looking at me with cold, hard eyes. He delivered a speech that felt rehearsed. He told me that my report had threatened investor confidence and that my behavior was damaging to the unity of the leadership team. He spoke about the company like it was a fragile deity I had blasphemed against. "We have to make a change for the good of the family," he said, smoothing his tie. "You are suspended effective immediately for 30 days, without pay." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I stood my ground. He wasn't finished. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. "To return, you will provide a handwritten apology to this board and to your brother. You will acknowledge that you overreacted, that your tone was harmful, and that you trust the vision of this leadership team." It was a demand for total submission. He didn't just want me out of the way. He wanted to break me. He wanted me to crawl back and admit that my integrity was a mistake. Ryan sat in the corner, looking at his phone, refusing to witness the execution. My father leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper he used when he wanted to hurt you without leaving a bruise. "You're not here to question me, Teresa. You're here to support the family. Don't forget this business can live without you, but without this business, you're nothing." The sentence hung in the air, vibrating with cruelty. He was attacking my identity, my future, my very worth as a human being. He truly believed that without the Collins name and the Collins paycheck, I was zero. He thought I would cry. He thought I would beg. He thought I would grasp at the edge of the desk and plead for my position. Instead, I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. The fear evaporated, replaced by a clarity so sharp it cut. I realized I had been trying to save the family image for years, protecting them from their own greed. But they didn't want to be saved. They wanted to be worshipped. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my report. I just looked him in the eye and said, "All right." My father blinked, surprised by the lack of resistance. He took it as defeat. He thought he had won. I turned around, walked to my office, and packed my personal items into a single box. I took the binder. I took the framed photo of my mother. I left the company laptop. As I walked past the security desk and out into the parking lot, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the hospital campus my parents had built. My father and brother thought they had sacrificed me to protect the Collins name. They thought they had put me in a timeout until I learned to behave. What they didn't know was that they hadn't just suspended an employee, they had just cut me loose. And a person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the world. The silence in my apartment that night was heavier than any silence I had ever known. On my coffee table lay the suspension letter, the paper crisp and white, bearing my father's signature in heavy black ink. It looked final. It looked like a death certificate for my career. I sat on my couch staring at it, feeling like I had been exiled from my own life. For 30 years I had defined myself by my utility to my family. I was the helpful one, the smart one, the one who fixed the problems Ryan created. Now my father's voice echoed in the empty room, looping over and over. Without this business, you're nothing. It was a terrifying thought because in the quiet of that living room, I was afraid he might be right. I felt untethered, drifting in a dark sea with no shore in sight. I closed my eyes and tried to push his voice out, replacing it with the memory of my mother. I thought back to the hospital charity galas she used to organize, how she would stand in the back of the room while Dad worked the crowd. I remembered her pulling me aside once when I was a teenager watching Dad charm a senator. She had said, "If we ever hurt the people we serve, Tess, this doesn't deserve to exist, no matter how big the building gets." That was the compass she had tried to leave me. My father had smashed that compass today, but I still knew where north was. I needed to know where I stood legally, not just morally. I picked up my phone and dialed Claire Jensen. Claire was an old law professor of mine, a woman who had spent decades fighting healthcare fraud before retiring to teach. She picked up on the second ring. I didn't give her names or specific locations, but I gave her the hypothetical scenario: a compliance officer who discovers systematic upcoding, reports it internally, and is suspended for it. Claire's voice was sharp, cutting through my self-pity. She explained the federal whistleblower protections, the False Claims Act, and the stark reality of my position. "Listen to me closely, Teresa," she said. "If you are the compliance officer and you know about fraud and you stay silent after being silenced, you aren't a victim. You're a co-conspirator. If the feds find this later, and they always do, they won't care that your daddy suspended you. They will look at your signature on the compliance logs and they will indict you right alongside him." The call ended, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The choice wasn't just about loyalty anymore. It was about survival. I could stay silent and risk prison to protect a father who thought I was nothing, or I could speak up and destroy the only life I had ever known. I walked into my bedroom and knelt on the floor. I reached deep under the bed, past the shoeboxes and the dust bunnies, until my hand touched cold metal. I pulled out the fireproof box my mother had given me 15 years ago. I hadn't opened it since the day she died. It was heavy, locked with a small key I kept on my keychain, a key I had carried every day without really knowing why. I sat cross-legged on the floor and turned the lock. The lid creaked open. Inside, there were no childhood mementos or jewelry. It was just paperwork, thick, legal-bound documents. I started reading and my breath caught in my throat. It was a trust. The Linda Collins Irrevocable Trust. My mother hadn't just left me her jewelry, she had left me her leverage. The documents detailed the ownership structure of Collins Care. I knew my parents co-founded it, but I always assumed Dad held the power. I was wrong. The trust held a 22% voting stake in the Collins Care network, a controlling block that had been shielded from my father's consolidation efforts. And according to the final page, the sole trustee with exclusive voting rights upon her death was me. Not Dad, not Ryan. Me. Under the legal stack was a handwritten letter on her personal stationery. The ink was slightly faded. I picked it up, my hands trembling. "My dearest Tess, if you are reading this, it means things have become difficult. I love your father, but I know his flaws. He builds statues of himself and forgets who holds the chisel. He will drift toward control, and eventually he may lose sight of why we started this. I trust you, Teresa. I trust your mind, and I trust your heart. You are the only one who always put the patients first. If your father ever tries to erase you, remember this, he can't. I made you part of this foundation whether he likes it or not. You are the check and the balance. I broke down. I sat on the floor and wept, clutching the letter to my chest. For years I believed I was the invisible daughter, the one who didn't matter. But Mom had seen everything. She had seen the future, and she had armed me for it. She hadn't just left me money, she had left me the power to stop him. I wiped my face and stood up. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. I wasn't nothing. I was the largest independent shareholder of the Collins Care Network. I walked to my dining table and opened my laptop. I didn't hesitate. I navigated to the secure portal for the Department of Justice's whistleblower intake. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I didn't write with anger. I wrote with precision. I uploaded the spreadsheets showing the upcoding. I uploaded the emails from Ryan demanding we rethink diagnoses. I uploaded the memos I had written that were ignored. I methodically laid out the entire scheme, attaching the digital evidence that proved my father and brother were defrauding the government and the community. The upload bar moved slowly across the screen. 20%, 50%, 80%. I watched it knowing that once it hit 100%, there was no going back. The family dinners, the holidays, the uneasy peace we had maintained, it would all be incinerated. It hit 100%. Submission received. Then I opened a second tab. I logged into the corporate governance portal, a site I usually accessed as an employee, but this time I used the credentials from the trust documents. I filed a formal notice to the Board of Directors emergency motion for independent review, filed by shareholder Teresa Collins. I sat back in the chair, the silence of the room returning, but it felt different now. It wasn't the silence of exile. It was the silence of a battlefield after the cannon has fired. The moment I clicked submit, I knew I wasn't just turning on my family. I was turning toward myself, maybe for the first time in my life. The next morning, the sun rose over the Collins Care headquarters with a deceptive brightness. To anyone driving past on the highway, we looked like the same pillar of community health we had always been. Inside, however, the fuse I had lit the night before was burning down to the final inch. I wasn't there when Ryan arrived, but I know the scene by heart because I know my brother. He would have walked in strutting fresh off a Peloton ride, ready for a scheduled media tour to boast about our record growth. He expected to see me at my desk, head down, buried in paperwork, serving my suspension in shame. Instead, he found a ghost town. My office door was open. My desk was stripped bare. My nameplate was gone, and sitting in the center of the mahogany surface was my laptop closed with a single white envelope resting on top of it. I arrived 20 minutes later not to work, but to witness the end of the era. I walked through the lobby, swiping my badge for the last time. The receptionist smiled at me, unaware that the building was effectively burning down around her. When I reached the executive suite, the silence was already broken. I heard shouting from my father's office. I walked toward the open door, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Ryan was pacing, his face flushed. My father was sitting behind his desk, holding my resignation letter like it was a piece of contaminated waste. And standing by the window, looking like he was about to vomit, was Mark Alvarez, our general counsel. Mark was the first to see me. He didn't say hello. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and stammered, "Tell me you didn't do it, Teresa. Tell me you didn't upload the report to the federal portal." My father looked up, his expression a mix of confusion and stubborn denial. He still believed he controlled the narrative. "She didn't," he scoffed, tossing my letter onto the desk. "She's grandstanding. She wouldn't do that to the family." I stepped into the room. I didn't sit down. I stood in the doorway, feeling a strange sense of height, as if I were looking down at them from a great distance. "I didn't just upload the report, Mark," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I submitted the full evidentiary file to the Department of Justice and the Office of Inspector General. The upload completed at 11:43 p.m. last night." The air left the room. Mark grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. Ryan stopped pacing and stared at me, his mouth slightly open. My father slowly stood up, his knuckles turning white as he leaned on his desk. You went to the feds, he whispered, the reality finally piercing his ego. You realized we are under review. You just invited them to tear this company apart. I invited them to see what you've built, I corrected. If there's nothing to hide, Dad, you have nothing to worry about. But we all know that's not true. You're fired. He spat, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Get out. You have no standing here. You are nothing. I resigned, I said calmly. But you're wrong about my standing. I reached into my bag and pulled out a photocopy of the trust documents. I walked over and placed them gently on his desk, right on top of my resignation letter. You might want to read the bylaws of the Linda Collins Irrevocable Trust. Mom left her voting shares to a trust dad, and upon her death, the sole trustee is me. I control 22% of the voting stock of this network. The silence that followed was absolute. My father looked down at the paper, reading the words he had never bothered to look for. He had been so busy consolidating power, he hadn't realized his wife had built a failsafe right under his nose. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. You spent years trying to erase me from this family. I told him, my voice trembling slightly with the weight of the truth. Mom spent years making sure you couldn't. Before he could respond, the room erupted. It started with Mark's phone, then Ryan's watch, then the landline on my father's desk. It was a cacophony of digital notifications. The federal agency had auto-generated the acknowledgement of the whistleblower complaint, sending immediate inquiries to the legal department. Simultaneously, the major insurers, whose algorithms likely flagged the same data I had, were demanding explanations for the coding anomalies. And most critically, the independent board members had received my emergency motion. Mark Alvarez looked at his phone and turned pale. It's the chairman of the board, he whispered. He's calling an emergency session. For today. Ryan panicked. He rushed toward me, his charm replaced by desperation. Teresa, stop this. You can withdraw it. Say it was a mistake. You're going to destroy everything our parents built. Everything. I looked at my brother, the golden child who had never been told no in his life. I didn't destroy it, Ryan, I said. Dad did that when he decided profit mattered more than the people who trusted us. I'm just the one turning on the lights. I turned and walked out of the office. The phones were still ringing, a chorus of alarms signaling the collapse of their house of cards. As I reached the elevator, Mark Alvarez ran into the hallway. Teresa. Wait. The board meeting is at 2 o'clock. You need to be there for questioning. I pressed the button for the lobby. I know, I said as the doors slid open. I'll be there. They thought I was walking back in later that afternoon, as the daughter they had suspended the employee they could bully. They were wrong. I was walking in as the woman holding the one thing they could never control, again the truth. The emergency board meeting was held in the same room where I had been suspended just days earlier, but the geometry of power had completely shifted. The blinds were drawn, shutting out the afternoon sun. At the head of the table sat the chairman of the board, a retired federal judge who had no patience for ambiguity. My father and Ryan sat on the left side, looking like prisoners awaiting sentencing. Mark Alvarez, our general counsel, sat with them, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. I sat alone on the right side, not as a disgruntled employee, but as the representative of the Linda Collins Trust. I had my binder, but I didn't need it. The truth was already burning a hole in the center of the table. The questioning was clinical and brutal. The independent board members had reviewed my submission. They asked me to walk them through the email chain where Ryan explicitly instructed clinic managers to hit revenue targets regardless of patient volume. I read the words aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet room. When I finished, the chairman turned to Ryan. My brother tried to speak, but he choked on his own excuses. He muttered something about aggressive goal setting and motivational language. It was pathetic. Then they turned to my father. He didn't look like the titan of industry anymore. He looked old. He tried to spin the narrative, leaning forward with a forced smile, claiming this was all a miscommunication caused by rapid expansion. He blamed the billing software. He blamed the complexity of federal regulations. He looked at the board members, men he had played golf with for years, and said, "We built this place on trust. Surely you don't think I would intentionally jeopardize that?" I couldn't let him hide behind the brand anymore. I interrupted him, my voice cutting through his fog of denial. "You didn't miscommunicate, Dad. You threatened your own staff's integrity. You ambushed them with impossible quotas and called it family loyalty. You made them choose between their paychecks and their ethics. That's not a software error. That's a leadership failure." The silence that followed was the sound of a legacy breaking. The board deliberated for less than 20 minutes. When they called us back, and the verdict was absolute. My father was to step down as CEO effective immediately. He was barred from all financial decision-making and relegated to a ceremonial role with no power. Ryan was removed from his executive position entirely and placed on administrative leave pending the federal investigation. Furthermore, the board announced they were opening negotiations with a large nonprofit hospital system to acquire majority control and stabilize the network. As the meeting adjourned, the head of the transition committee approached me. He looked relieved to have a sane person in the room. He offered me the role of Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer for the new entity, with a significant raise and a seat on the executive committee. "We need you to fix this, Teresa," he said. "You're the only one who knows where the bodies are buried." I looked at him, then at my father, who was slumped in his chair staring at the wall. I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "I'm done cleaning up problems you refuse to admit you caused. I'm not the janitor for this family anymore." The aftermath was swift and public. The local news ran stories for weeks about the fines and the restructuring. The community felt betrayed, but there was also a sense of relief that the rot had been cut out before it killed the patient. My father's fall was absolute. He was eventually allowed to work part-time as a physician in one of the outlying clinics, stripped of his title and his empire. Ryan fared worse. His social standing evaporated overnight. With the investigation hanging over him, his job offers dried up. He quietly left town a month later, taking a sales job in Arizona that was far below his imagined status. I didn't stay to watch the dust settle. I took a job 3 hours away with a smaller community-focused hospital network. The pay was significantly less, but the integrity was non-negotiable. I loved it. I was valued for my competence, not my last name. My life became smaller, but it felt infinitely bigger because it was finally mine. I started dating a man named Sam, a former EMT who was now a data analyst. He didn't care about medical empires or country clubs. He cared about whether I was happy. We adopted a rescue dog, a scruffy terrier mix with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down. I named him Barnaby. He was loyal, but he didn't demand perfection, which was exactly the kind of loyalty I needed. One evening, about 6 months after the hearing, I was sitting on the porch of my new bungalow. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Barnaby was sleeping at my feet, and Sam was inside making dinner. The air smelled of rain and pine needles. My phone buzzed on the railing. I looked at the screen. It was my father. I stared at the name for a long time. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I walked out of the boardroom. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but something made me pick it up. His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the bravado that had defined him for decades. He asked how I was. He asked about the weather. And then he asked if he could drive up to see me. "I'd like to see you, Teresa," he said, and the vulnerability in his voice was terrifying because it was real. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the life I had built from the ashes of his expectations. The man who once told me I was nothing without his business was now asking if I had time for him. I didn't know if I had forgiveness, but I did have terms. "You can come," I said, my voice steady, "but only if you come as my dad." If Michael Collins, the CEO, shows up, I won't open the door. He was silent for a moment. Okay, he whispered. Okay. It has been 3 years since the day I walked out of that boardroom, and my life looks nothing like the one my father had mapped out for me. I didn't disappear, and I certainly didn't become nothing, as he had predicted. Today, I run my own consulting firm specializing in ethical leadership transitions for family-owned healthcare businesses. It is ironic, I suppose, that I now make a living teaching powerful men how to avoid becoming my father. I travel around the state conducting workshops for boards and heirs, teaching them how to separate bloodlines from bottom lines. I use anonymized case studies, pieces of my own history to show them how ego and favoritism can rot a legacy from the inside out. I tell them that a business built on secrets is just a ruin waiting for gravity to do its job. I think often about that first visit my father made to my porch 6 months after the collapse of his empire. When his car pulled into my driveway, it wasn't the sleek black Mercedes he had driven for 20 years. It was a sensible 4-year-old sedan. When he stepped out, he wasn't wearing the Italian suit that used to be his armor. He was wearing a cardigan and jeans. He looked smaller, older, and for the first time, human. We sat on my porch for a long time, watching the sun dip below the tree line, the silence between us filled with the ghosts of everything we hadn't said. I didn't let him off the hook easily. I asked him the question that had been burning in my chest since I was 12 years old, standing halfway out of the frame in that family photo. Did you protect Ryan because he was older? I asked him, watching his hands tremble slightly as he held his coffee mug. Or did you protect him because he made you feel important? My father looked at me, his eyes wet. He didn't try to spin it. He didn't use his doctor voice. He just looked at the floorboards and admitted the truth. He was the applause, Teresa. He reflected everything I wanted to believe about myself. You were the work. You were the reality. I leaned on you because you were strong enough to carry it, but I celebrated him because he made me feel powerful. He looked up at me then, and I saw a man who had lost his kingdom, but found his conscience. I sacrificed your emotional needs to maintain my image, he said softly. I spent years trying to control our legacy. In the process, I tried to erase the one person who actually saved it. I didn't forgive him in that moment. Forgiveness is a process, not a switch you flip. But we reached a truce. A new, modest relationship began that day. We have dinner once a month now. We talk about books. We talk about the garden he started planting in his retirement. We talk about my business. We never talk about the old Collins care. That empire is gone, swallowed up by the larger system, corrected and sanitized. The name on the building changed, and honestly, the town is better for it. I have redefined what family means to me. It is no longer a hierarchy of obedience or a debt I owe for being born. It is a circle of mutual respect. I have built a chosen family that actually shows up for me. My partner Sam respects my independence and never asks me to shrink myself to fit a room. My team at work challenges me without trying to undermine me. And my dog Barnaby reminds me every day that loyalty is about love, not leverage. When I look back at the woman I was, the quiet daughter hiding in the supply closet, the compliance officer staring at spreadsheets in the dark, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for her. She was terrified, but she moved anyway. She realized something that I tell my clients at the end of every workshop, and it's something I want you to understand too. We are often taught that keeping the peace is the highest virtue in a family. We are taught to swallow our questions and hide our bruises to keep the boat steady. But silence in the face of wrongdoing isn't peace, it's participation. My revenge wasn't about destroying Colin's care or humiliating my father. It was about forcing the truth into the light. It was about refusing to let them bury my integrity along with their secrets. I didn't burn the house down. I just stopped holding up the roof so they could see the sky. My father once told me that the business could live without me and that I was nothing without it. He told me he could erase me from the story if he chose to. He was wrong. The day I chose my conscience over his approval, was the day my life stopped belonging to my parents' empire and finally belonged to me. I don't need a building with my name on it to know who I am. I don't need a title to know my worth. And the only signature my future needs now is mine. Teresa Collins found her voice by walking away from the empire that tried to silence her, proving that integrity is the only legacy worth keeping. If this story of reclaiming power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. What would you have done if you were in Teresa's position? Let us know down below because we read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.